Today, as I mentioned, is Father's Day, and we want to honor all fathers. Our fathers who've gone before us, those who still are with us, our fathers who are here in the assembly, and the fathers who will later be watching on the television and the laptops and those things as they listen to this lesson whenever they want to, wherever they may be. We want to honor all fathers. The idea of fatherhood, we want to go back to the basis of it. And I want to touch on some things today that may seem a little strong, but the word strong is a word that ought to apply to manhood. A person can be a good, strong man and not be a father, but he cannot be a good father without being a strong man. If you ever went to the carnivals or to the circus, perhaps, and you get out into that midway area where they're giving prizes and so forth, you may have seen an individual who was over there with that big bell at the top and had that big, wide mallet, and he's chirping something like, "Ring the bell, ring the bell, ring the bell and win the pretty lady a prize. Show your strength, ring the bell." I never did try that, but anytime I would have walked by it, I promise you, I would have been challenged, because the man is appealing to my ego. He's saying, "Prove you're a man. Prove how strong you are. Show this beautiful lady with whom you're walking that you are a strong individual." I, for one, would have wanted to do that, and I suspect everybody who paid his money was really just wanting to prove that point. But there's something integral in us that causes the male to be like that. And I don't think it's by accident whatsoever, and that what we consider here together may in fact underline that very well. If we look at 1 Kings chapter 2, in the very first part of the chapter, David the king has decided that it's time for him to hand the reins, as it were, over to his son Solomon. He has served in many good ways. He's made some mistakes. He wanted to build a temple, but he couldn't because he was a man of blood. But he's able to make his next king, his son Solomon. Whenever he met with Solomon on the day that he would, as it were, ordain him to be king, he appealed to him to be strong and show yourself a man and keep the charge that you have from God. Be courageous, he said, and be strong, and keep God's commandments, and keep his statutes, and keep all the rules that God has given, in order that you may be strong. Man needs to be strong. And in leading for God over the children of Israel, David had every reason to call upon his son to show himself a man, make it clear, make it evident. And the way that he said you'll be able to do that is by being strong, and the way that you'll be able to be strong is by submitting to God, by keeping his commands and doing the things that God has caused you to do. And so in that same way, he was saying man has been empowered to take a special role, a special lead, to do the will of God. No wonder he'd say, "Be a man, my son." It's clear. If you go into the time even of creation, it becomes abundantly clear that God put man at the helm, that he put him in the lead. He created man first. Paul later says there's significance to that he created man first and then Eve. We know the order of all that. But the reason was because man was to lead. He was to be the one who would be out front, the one who would be the challenger, the one who'd be the protector, the one who'd be the provider. That's the way God had it. If you go back to the way God had it, then today's significance in appealing to fathers to be men is very applicable. Jesus in Matthew chapter 19 was challenged by the Jews of his time about divorce and remarriage and that sort of thing. And whenever Jesus answered their question, he referred them to the beginning. He said, from the beginning, it was not so. They were saying Moses allowed a writing of divorcement. So why are you saying that a man should marry and have one wife and they two should stay together when Moses allowed them to write a writing of divorcement and this woman to be set aside? And Jesus said, that's not the way it started. That's not the way God designed it. If you look at how God designed it, the scriptures, there was one male and one female. There was a man and there was a woman. There was a male and a female who became a dad and a mom. And that was the basis of a family where children were produced with the instruction that they were to multiply and replenish the earth with population from the beginning. That's the way it was. If today someone came and looked at our social environment, if someone looked at our cultural development of what we have and are experiencing in this country, they might often ask the question, what about these changes? What about the way it's being done now? And I believe if Jesus were on the earth still, to many of the questions we might pose, Jesus would say, it was not so from the beginning. That's not how God designed it. It's not how he planned it. For God in the creation story explains that everything had the seed in itself and that everything would produce after itself. And God saw that was good. What that really means is that in order for man and woman to procreate, to reproduce, to multiply, and fulfill the command that God gave them, was that there had to be the seed in man. There had to be that sperm that would fertilize the egg, and a human child would come forth. And that in other creatures created, there would similarly be in the male the sperm that would fertilize the egg of the female, and they would reproduce. And even in the plant kingdom, there'd be the equality of that in pollination and reproduction. And no gathering of two human beings in the beginning to reproduce would have been anything but a man and a woman. From the beginning, that's the way it was. Also in the animal kingdom and even in the plant kingdom, each so reproducing. But we live now in a different time when people have instituted so many cultural changes that cause us to see a different emphasis, where the time has come that men are valued less, and consequently fatherhood is valued less. It's cultural. Adam was the father rule. The first section of the Bible is called the patriarchal period. That means father rule. When God communicated with the heads of tribes, the men, and then under the law of Moses, if you read even as that law is about to be introduced in Deuteronomy chapter 4 and chapter 5, that there is a special responsibility that is given to mankind, and that is more specifically given to you fathers. You fathers, bring up your children. You fathers, train them. It's iterated by Paul in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 1 through 4, where he says, "Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but to bring them up in the nature and the admonition of the Lord." That is not at all to belittle the role of mother. No one should ever belittle, minimize in any way the role of the mother. And that's not necessary in order to lift up the role of the father, to respect and understand and hopefully restore the role of the father. You don't have to at all push down womankind or that mother, any mother at all, or the females of the race, or of the human people. You don't have to do that, for each has his own role. In those days, he made the father as the leader, the one who was first and foremost responsible for the training of these young people. I was reading various writers this week about these concepts, and one of them said something that I'd never thought about before. I'm sorry I don't have in my notes the name that I can refer to just now, but I do want to say that it's not my creation, but someone else said this. He said, and this is a stretch a bit, but please go with me, that if there was a knock at your door at your house, and you went to the door, and it was God who had come to check on the children, he would ask to speak to your husband, ladies. If he came to check on how the children were being raised, he'd ask if your husband is home. He'd not discount you, but he'd know I made the responsibility primarily his. We say, where's our problem? Well, our problem is this. Beginning in the 1960s and early 1970s, a sociological and cultural movement began in this country that was driven by the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, part of which pushed the female agenda and minimized the importance of and the role of men in this culture and in the family. And as time went on, it has been pushed further and further. And our culture changed more and more with the acceptance of that amendment and then the case of Roe versus Wade and the legalization of abortion. Consequently, over the years, the value of man in the society and in the home has been lesser and lesser and lesser. And I wouldn't have thought so. I was there when those things were developing. I remember debating the issue of the ERA, or Equal Rights Amendment, on a Seattle radio station. I remember when it was a hot and heavy idea, and some people fought strongly against it and others adhered to it, and those who fought against it didn't win. I was there watching as it started, but folks, over the years, as we adapt to our environment, it seems that men in general have dumbed down on their strength, their outspoken nature, their leadership, and their participation in the family. And today, one of the greatest maladies that we have in this society is the absence of the male role in the household. And studies, you see, we've had 50 years now. And at 50 years, there's been time for there to be patterns and trends that are developed and to be reported. Those trends indicate that in those homes where the father isn't present, or the father is there and he's John D. Milquetoast and does not stand up and doesn't assert himself as the household head, that those boys who are raised under those circumstances in female-dominated households turn out to be the most antisocial individuals we have in our society. They are the ones who are most problematic when it comes to sexual abuse, rape, and murder of women, who don't value women for anything except as a sexual receiver. They do not have respect for womankind and seem to be unable to learn because they didn't have a teacher. They are the ones who violate the most of the laws. They are the ones who create so much pain. More than any other single group, that's what happened. From the beginning, it was not so. And I don't mean at all to make someone feel bad who doesn't need to feel bad. I must stop to say that mothers who just couldn't help the fact that their husband, or sometimes it's not even a husband, it's a partner, who helped conceive, but who abandoned as soon as there was responsibility. And those mothers wish it was different, wish that the man had been a man, would be a man. And they do the best they can. I don't mean to push them down at all. But the statistics and the facts are what they are. And when David said, "Son, show yourself a man," there was a lot to that. And we need to raise our boys in the best homes that we can, with the best influence they can have. And we need to make them aware that in the next generation, we need them to step up. And in this generation, we need their dads to step up, because this sociological, cultural trend in which we're trying to build a church, raise families, and help people go to heaven is one that has been emasculated to the point that we don't have the influence that God intended for us to have in the role of men. Consequently, he calls us. I've said that we have accepted that lesser role far too much. Is it making any difference? Is the environment changing? Well, already, this is the product. Already our schools are teaching, and this was co-enjoined with the ERA at the time. The issue of sex education in the school was part of it, part of what I was debating in Seattle. Now the schools teach sex and provide protection and counsel to your children. And you don't have to be involved, dads. You don't have to know. We've been quiet long enough. Already, abortions are legal, and our children, your child, can be counseled by a school counselor supported by public tax, and that counselor can advise your child without your consent, without your endorsement, in regard to having an abortion. And you may never know that it happened, for you don't have a legal right. It's already true. Our young people have, for the last 40 years at least, been being desensitized to the concept of there being a male role that's supposed to be a strong, primary, leading role. And they've been taught, desensitized in the public schools, to accept everybody as totally equal in every respect, to embrace every kind of lifestyle and treat them all equally, and to make no distinctions whatsoever, and to value morality as simply a matter of personal opinion, rather than having been taught what's right. And David told Solomon, you show yourself a man by accepting the charge that God has given you, and you accomplish it by keeping his laws, his rules, his statutes. You do what's right. You do what God taught. You go by what God has said. And what we're talking about here is not what God has said. But in spite of the fact that we've reached this point, I still don't see any uprising. By that, I don't mean going somewhere downtown and breaking windows. I don't mean riot. I mean people exercising what the law provides. I don't see churches that are having more men step forward to be elders and deacons and Bible class teachers and all the other things than they can use. But I see more and more the tendency to draw back, and more of the tendency to have the female role lead the church. And some churches, not very many among us, but some among us, have now put women in the pulpits and set aside what God's law says about that. And in many communities, particularly small, rural and agrarian communities, many of the churches seldom have a man as the pastor or the spiritual leader in the church. And it's very popular. And ladies, don't get mad at me. I hope you won't. But the women like that. Because 50 years of this has drawn us to the place that it seems normal. And the men just sit. And what they typically do is they just sit at home or the coffee shop, and they don't even go to church. They've turned it over. Son, be a man. And if what I tell you now, up to this point, is not enough for some of us to stand up, as they say, on our hind legs and be counted, maybe just a little glimpse of where the trends are leading us, not very far down the road. Maybe this preview will help you to get some courage, men, if you're one who needs it. Very soon, we will not be able to label those bathrooms in that hall over there as men's and women's bathrooms or the ones in the fellowship hall. And very soon, we'll be unable legally to require people to use those bathrooms who have the same sex as our little girls and our little boys do. We're very, very close. There'll be no separate showers at the schools. And our little girls, when they play volleyball or basketball or whatever, will have to go in and be showered, maybe watched by a male teacher or coach who might or might not be of the same sexual preference as they are. Schools will be forced soon to allow men to watch the girls as they shower and can't discriminate. And men, pretty soon, if the trends continue, your wife may go to the hospital, and unless she is assigned a private room, there's a vacant bed in the same room with her, and a man is assigned it, you won't be able to say a thing about there being a man staying in the other bed that's in the room where your wife is. You see, it was tested and nobody said anything. It was tested and nobody did anything in the co-ed dorms and the universities. And now a generation has gone through that process who take it for granted, who live in the same dorms, and when they go home on weekends like to take home their close friend and be in the same bedroom with them. And I forgot, that's probably a close friend with opposite sex, but from the same dorm. And we've been pretty quiet about that too. I'm not saying rebellion. I'm saying let's wake up and smell the roses, folks. Let's get a breath of air of what's going on, what's happening here. These things are about to happen. And your 13-year-old daughter will go to the airport. Right now, whenever a female needs a, quote, they call pat down, you'll hear them say, female assist. And a woman comes and performs that. But pretty soon, that'll probably be illegal to call for anybody of the same sex, and whoever's there does the pat down. And your little virgin girl is patted down by a man. Is that what it'll take for us to say, I think I'd like to kind of put on my britches and be a man. I'd like to put on my big boy shirt and start to speak up. Be a man, my son. Is that where it goes? Or will it go one step further? And proposals are that very soon your minor child may report to his or her physician that they think they'd like to be of the other sex. And the physician can prescribe sex-changing drugs without your permission or your knowledge. Is that what it will take? You see, these things aren't yet in place, and they could be avoided. But while we quietly sit and we just let happen what happens without our speaking out, we're right on the cusp of these being realities. I'm not an alarmist, am I? I'm not a radical, am I? And I forgot to mention, very soon, if we refuse to perform a same-sex marriage in this church building, we'll be sued and probably closed. Is that what it takes? Son, be a man. The greatest example of manhood I ever know about is Jesus. A man who gave his life for others, paid the ultimate price. The greatest men who follow him are men who decide to follow him, who decide, I want to be like Jesus. And I want to serve, and I want to lead. And if it takes the sacrifice of my life to save my family, I will die. Be a man. And the example that family needs is of an obedient Christian father who knows that Jesus is Lord, believes it firmly enough that he will confess the name of Jesus before anybody, anywhere, no matter what, who will repent of his sins and be buried with Christ in baptism and born again to be a child of God. That's what your boy needs to see. That's what your girl needs to see. It starts there. Being a Christian and then living the Christian life. If you're a daddy who hasn't set that example, be a man, son. Do the right thing. Whoever we are, we need to submit to Jesus and honor him and God, his Father, our Father, by doing the things that he has commanded. If you've never become a Christian, today I hope in closing that you will, on this day, let us help you as you're buried with Christ in baptism. If you're a part of the kingdom, but you've been sliding through and maybe falling into these cracks and just letting culture lead you, suck you down like it does most today, I hope you'll catch hold of something, grab on, and pull up, ring that bell, show that woman at your house you are a man. Show that girl, show your boy, show the world, I'm a man. If you're subject to the invitation of Jesus, I ask you, in this case, to surrender. But your surrender is victory. You surrender to the will of God. Come right now while we stand and sing.